When my parents tried to cut me off from my grandmother, I thought it was about control. I didn't realize it was about $30 million until much later. At first, it sounded almost reasonable. They said Grandma Evelyn was tired. They said she needed peace. They said too many visits confused her. But the words didn't match the feeling in my chest when my calls went unanswered, and my messages stayed on read without reply. 1 week after my wedding, the woman who had raised me more than anyone else suddenly didn't want to see me. That was how my mother put it. Calm, polite, final. I remember standing in my kitchen in Portland, phone in my hand, staring at my reflection in the microwave door, trying to understand how a bond built over 35 years could be erased in a single sentence. I wanted to argue. I wanted to drive over there and knock until someone answered. But something stopped me. A quiet instinct sharpened by years of being the inconvenient one in my family. So I did the opposite of what they expected. I stayed silent. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the first move that saved both of us. My name is Claire Anderson. I am 35 years old, and I have always been the child who didn't quite fit where I was told I belonged. I live in a small sunlit house on the east side of Portland, the kind of place with creaky floors and too many books stacked in corners. I built my life without leaning on my parents, not because I didn't want their help, but because I learned early that independence was the only way to stay visible in a family that preferred obedience. I have a steady career, a marriage I chose for love rather than approval, and a habit of watching people more than I speak. That habit would matter later more than I knew. Growing up, I learned the rules without anyone spelling them out. Don't make things difficult. Don't ask too many questions. And most importantly, don't challenge the version of the family my parents liked to present to the world. My younger sister Sophie followed those rules effortlessly. She was agreeable, accommodating, always in the right place at the right time. I was not. The one person who never asked me to be smaller was my grandmother Evelyn Anderson. Grandma Evelyn is 82 years old now, though she carries herself with the quiet certainty of someone who has survived more than she ever talks about. When I was a child, her house felt like a different country. The air smelled like tea and old books. Time moved slower there. She listened without interrupting, and when she spoke, she chose her words carefully as if they mattered. When my parents criticized me for being too outspoken, she would smile and say nothing, then slip me a handwritten note later. When Sophie was praised and I was overlooked, she would squeeze my hand and remind me that attention and worth were not the same thing. She never compared us. She never asked me to change. It was Grandma Evelyn who taught me how to read fine print, how to ask what wasn't being said, and why rushing a decision usually meant someone else was trying to benefit from your confusion. She used to say that silence, when chosen, could protect you better than shouting ever could. At the time, I thought it was just wisdom that came with age. I didn't know she was preparing me. My parents, Mark and Linda Anderson, had always described themselves as practical people. They believed in efficiency order and doing what made sense. In practice, that meant they liked control. My father spoke in absolutes, framing his opinions as common sense. My mother wrapped hers in concern, smiling as she drew boundaries no one had asked for. Together, they made decisions quickly and expected everyone else to adjust. Sophie fit neatly into that system. She lived close by, dropped in often, and knew exactly when to agree and when to stay quiet. Over the years, she became the family translator, the one who spoke for Grandma Evelyn whenever it was convenient. I noticed it, but I didn't yet understand why it bothered me so deeply. Before my wedding, there were signs I ignored because I wanted peace. When I suggested Grandma help with small details, my parents said it would tire her out. When I asked her opinion about seating or music, Sophie answered for her, even when Grandma was sitting right there. Each time it was explained away as concern. Each time something in my gut tightened. On the morning of my wedding, I believed things would finally come together. I told myself that milestones had a way of smoothing rough edges, that family tensions dissolved when love was celebrated openly. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. What I did know even then was that Grandma Evelyn mattered to me more than appearances. I wanted her close, not just physically, but visibly. I wanted the world to see what I had always known, that she was my anchor. A week after the wedding, when my mother told me Grandma needed space from me, I felt the ground shift under my feet. It wasn't just the message. It was how easily they said it, how rehearsed it sounded, how little room there was for discussion. I asked to hear it from Grandma herself. They said she was resting. I offered to stop by quietly. They said it wasn't a good time. Sophie texted me later, telling me to respect Grandma's wishes as if they were facts instead of a story being repeated until it sounded true. That was when I realized something important. No one had actually told me what Grandma wanted. They had only told me what they wanted me to believe she wanted. So I stepped back. I stopped calling. I stopped pushing. I watched. And as I watched, patterns began to form. My parents suddenly knew Grandma's schedule in detail. Sophie answered her phone more often than Grandma did. Decisions were being made quickly without explanation, always framed as necessary, always framed as care. It would have been easy to explode, to accuse them of manipulation without proof. But I remembered Grandma's voice, steady and calm, reminding me that silence could buy time. So I waited. That was the week I understood that my family wasn't protecting my grandmother. They were protecting something else entirely. And whatever it was, they were willing to erase me to keep it safe. If my parents were so determined to keep me away, I had to ask myself what they were afraid Grandma Evelyn might tell me. That question followed me everywhere in the days after the silence began, echoing in the quiet spaces of my house and in the pauses between unanswered calls. Every time I replayed my mother's calm voice saying that Grandma needed space, the words felt rehearsed, as if they had been practiced until they sounded reasonable. Thinking back, I realized this fear didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years, quietly, patiently, the way resentment and greed often do. To understand how we ended up here, I have to go back to my childhood, to the woman they could never fully control. When I was little, Grandma Evelyn's house was my refuge. It sat on a quiet street lined with old trees, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of tea leaves and polished wood. The front door creaked when you opened it, and she never fixed it because she said it reminded her that nothing needed to be perfect to be loved. I spent countless afternoons there after school, especially on days when being at home felt like walking on eggshells. My parents liked order. Grandma liked people. She let me talk until I ran out of words, never interrupting, never correcting my feelings. When I complained about being compared to Sophie, she didn't tell me to try harder or be more understanding. She simply said, "You don't need to compete in a race you never agreed to run." That sentence stayed with me longer than any advice my parents ever gave. Even as a child, I noticed how differently Grandma was treated. My parents spoke over her in conversations, finishing her sentences as if she might lose her place. They decided things for her without asking, calling it efficiency. But when it was just the two of us, she was sharp, observant, and quietly amused by the world. She taught me practical things that most people don't think to teach children. How to read contracts slowly. How to notice what was missing from an agreement, not just what was written. She showed me how to keep important papers organized, and told me never to sign anything when I felt rushed. Urgency is usually someone else's problem, she used to say, tapping the page with her finger. As I grew older, the difference between how my parents saw her and who she really was became impossible to ignore. They treated her like a responsibility. I treated her like a person. The favoritism in our family wasn't subtle, even when we pretended it was. Sophie was praised for being helpful, agreeable, close to home. I was labeled independent, which sounded like a compliment but always felt like a warning. When Sophie stayed quiet, she was mature. When I asked questions, I was difficult. Grandma never played that game. To her, we were simply two different people, neither more deserving than the other. I remember one afternoon when I was a teenager sitting at Grandma's kitchen table while she kneaded dough for bread. My parents had just left after another tense visit, and I was close to tears. Sophie had been praised for something I had actually done, and I didn't understand why correcting the story made me the problem. Grandma didn't stop what she was doing. She just said, "They don't like what they can't control." At the time, I thought she meant my stubbornness. Now I know she meant much more than that. As the years passed, I saw my parents' attempts to manage Grandma become more obvious. My father started holding onto her documents for safekeeping. My mother insisted on attending appointments she wasn't asked to join. Sophie began positioning herself as the go-between, the helpful granddaughter who knew everything Grandma needed. But there was one thing they could never quite do. They could never make Grandma afraid of them. She listened, she nodded, she allowed them to believe they were in charge, and then she made her own decisions anyway. I didn't realize how much of this was intentional until much later. At the time, it just felt like Grandma was choosing her battles carefully. She never argued publicly. She never embarrassed anyone. She simply refused to be rushed. In the years leading up to my wedding, I noticed a shift. My parents suddenly became more attentive to Grandma's routine. They talked about her health constantly, even when there was nothing new to report. Sophie began answering her phone more often than Grandma did, claiming it was easier that way. I brushed it off because it was easier to believe good intentions than to confront uncomfortable truths. I wanted my wedding to be simple, joyful, and free of family conflict. I told myself that whatever tensions existed would fade once the celebration was over. There was one conversation, though, that should have stayed with me more than it did. A few years before my wedding, Grandma and I were sitting together on her porch watching the late afternoon light stretch across the yard. She was quieter than usual, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Out of nowhere, she said, "If one day they try to separate us, don't fight them immediately." I laughed nervously and asked what she meant, assuming she was talking in hypotheticals. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at the time and said, "Silence buys you time." I nodded, not fully understanding, and the moment passed. Or so I thought. Now, standing in my empty kitchen years later, that memory came back with a clarity that made my chest ache. Grandma hadn't been speaking in riddles. She had been preparing me for a future she already sensed was coming. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little access I had to Grandma without my family's involvement. I hadn't noticed it because it happened gradually, wrapped in concern and convenience. My parents didn't forbid me from seeing her. They simply made it complicated. There was always a reason, always an excuse, always a delay. When I tried to schedule time alone with her, Sophie volunteered to come along. When I called, someone else answered first. When Grandma spoke, she was often interrupted, redirected, or corrected. Yet in the rare moments when I managed to catch her alone, she was exactly the same woman she had always been. Clear-eyed, thoughtful, fully present. That contrast was what finally convinced me that something wasn't right. You don't lose your clarity only when certain people are in the room. You don't suddenly become incapable only when decisions are being discussed. I began to understand why my parents were uneasy around her. Grandma Evelyn didn't forget. She didn't get confused. And most importantly, she didn't hand over control easily. The thought that they might be afraid of her choices, not her health, settled in my mind, like a stone. I didn't yet know what those choices involved, but I knew they mattered. By the time my parents told me Grandma didn't want to see me anymore, I could feel the outline of something larger taking shape. I didn't have proof, I didn't have answers, but I had enough history to know that this wasn't about peace or rest or space. It was about power. And the woman they were underestimating, the woman they thought they could manage from behind polite smiles and careful words, had taught me everything I needed to recognize that truth. As I stood there, phone still in my hand, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't react. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of believing their story without question. If Grandma Evelyn had chosen silence for a reason, I would honor that choice. Because whatever my family was hiding, I had a feeling it was far bigger than they realized. By the time my wedding plans were officially underway, the war had already begun. It just hadn't turned loud yet. At first, it was subtle enough that I questioned myself for noticing. A pause before answers, a hesitation when I asked simple questions, a sense that conversations shifted the moment I entered the room. Planning a wedding is supposed to be chaotic, in a joyful way, full of choices about flowers and music and guest lists. For me, it became something else entirely. Every time I tried to include Grandma Evelyn in even the smallest decision, an invisible hand redirected the moment. If I asked her opinion on the ceremony, time my father answered instead. If I mentioned seating arrangements, my mother smiled and said we didn't want to overwhelm her. If Grandma started to speak, Sophie gently cut in, finishing her sentence with a version that sounded safer, simpler, smaller. At first I told myself they were just trying to help. Weddings bring out everyone's opinions, and my family had never been good at stepping back. But the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Somehow every path that led directly to Grandma ended up blocked by someone else's concern. I noticed it most clearly during one of the early planning dinners. We were sitting around my parents' dining table, the same one where I had eaten countless meals growing up. I suggested that Grandma might like to help choose the music since she loved old standards and always said they reminded her of dancing when she was young. Before Grandma could respond, Sophie leaned forward. "She gets tired with too many details," she said quickly, her voice light and practiced. "We'll just surprise her on the day." Grandma smiled faintly but didn't speak. When I looked at her, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not confusion, not fatigue, recognition. As the weeks passed, those moments multiplied. I would try to coordinate a dress-fitting visit only to be told Grandma had a doctor's appointment that day. I'd suggest a quiet lunch together and my mother would say it wasn't a good time, that Grandma needed rest. Somehow, Sophie always knew exactly when Grandma was available and when she wasn't, even though she never seemed to ask. What unsettled me most was how invested my parents suddenly became in Grandma's schedule. They spoke about it with a level of detail that felt new. My father knew her appointment times down to the minute. My mother tracked her medications, even though Grandma had managed them herself for years. They framed it as responsibility, but it felt more like surveillance. The first moment that truly made my stomach drop came on a quiet afternoon when I stopped by my parents' house unannounced. I was dropping off some paperwork related to the venue and didn't expect anyone to be home. As I walked up the driveway, I heard my father's voice through the open window. He was on the phone, speaking in low, careful tones. "We need to do it before she changes her mind," he said. "Keep it simple. No need to complicate things." I froze, my hand still on the doorframe. My heart began to pound, not because I understood what he meant, but because I knew he didn't want me to hear it. When I stepped inside, he ended the call abruptly and smiled too quickly. "Didn't hear you come in," he said. I asked him what he had meant. He waved a hand dismissively, telling me it was nothing important, just scheduling. He changed the subject before I could press further, asking about flowers and catering like the conversation had never happened. But it had happened, and it stayed with me. Not long after that, I noticed Sophie stepping more confidently into a role she had never held before. She started positioning herself as the gatekeeper. If I wanted to see Grandma, I had to go through her. If I had a question, Sophie answered it. If Grandma and I were talking and Sophie entered the room, Grandma's voice softened, her sentences shorter, her opinions less specific. The strangest part was that Sophie had never been particularly close to Grandma before. She visited on holidays. She brought flowers when it was expected. But she had never lingered, never sat for hours talking the way I did. Now she was suddenly everywhere, always helpful, always present. I tried not to show my discomfort. I told myself I was being sensitive because of the stress of planning a wedding. But then there was the afternoon I managed to catch Grandma alone and everything shifted. I had stopped by her house early, hoping to talk before anyone else arrived. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, a book resting unopened in her lap. When she saw me, her face softened in that familiar way that always made me feel like I was home. We talked about ordinary things at first: the weather, the neighbor's new dog, the roses she was trying to keep alive despite the heat. But there was a tension beneath her words, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. Finally, I asked if everything was all right. She hesitated just for a moment and then said something that made my breath catch. "They're nervous," she said quietly. I asked her who she meant. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like she was weighing something important. "If one day they tell you I don't want to see you," she said, "would you believe them?" The question stunned me. I laughed softly, trying to brush it off, but she didn't smile back. She was serious. "Of course not," I said, though suddenly I wasn't as certain as I wanted to be. She nodded slowly as if filing that answer away. Then she changed the subject, asking about the ceremony and whether I was eating enough. The conversation moved on, but my mind did not. That question replayed itself over and over in my head in the days that followed. It felt like a warning one I hadn't fully understood yet. The closer the wedding came, the more tangible the control became. Grandma's phone was often out of reach when I called. Sophie explained that Grandma misplaced it frequently, even though I had never known her to do that. Mail arrived at my parents' house instead of hers. My father mentioned taking care of some paperwork without elaborating. One afternoon, I noticed a large envelope on the edge of my parents' kitchen counter, the corner marked with the logo of a legal office. When I asked about it, my mother moved it out of sight so quickly it was almost instinctive. She told me it was nothing I needed to worry about. That was when it finally became clear that I wasn't imagining things. These weren't random acts of concern. They were coordinated, planned. By the time my wedding day arrived, I felt a strange sense of dread layered beneath the excitement. I still hoped irrationally that the ceremony would bring everyone back into alignment, that standing together in a room full of witnesses would remind my family who we were supposed to be to each other. I didn't yet know that the wedding wouldn't heal anything. It would expose everything. Looking back now, I can see how carefully the ground was being prepared. How each small redirection, each softened lie, each withheld conversation built toward something larger. The war before my wedding was quiet, fought with smiles and concern and words like safety and responsibility. No one raised their voice. No one made threats. But the lines were drawn all the same. And while I didn't yet know what my family was planning to take, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. By the time I walked down the aisle, the decision to cut me out of my grandmother's life had already been made. The day of my wedding arrived like a performance everyone had rehearsed except me. From the moment I woke up, there was a sense that the script had already been written, and I was expected to follow it without questions. I told myself I was imagining things that nerves could distort even the clearest moments. I was wrong. I got ready in a small room at the venue surrounded by soft light and the low hum of hairdryers. My dress hung by the window, ivory and simple, exactly what I had wanted. Friends fluttered around me, offering reassurance, adjusting small details. I kept glancing at the door, expecting Grandma Evelyn to walk in at any moment, her calm presence grounding me the way it always had. She didn't. When I asked my mother where Grandma was, she smiled and said she was resting, that the morning had tired her out. The words sounded reasonable, but they landed wrong. Grandma had always been the earliest one ready for important days. She believed showing up early was a sign of respect. I brushed off the discomfort and focused on the ceremony. I told myself I would see her soon enough. When the music started and guests took their seats, I felt my chest tighten. I scanned the rows, searching for Grandma's familiar silver hair and steady posture. I didn't see her near the front. I didn't see her near the aisle. I finally spotted her several rows back, partially obscured by taller guests sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. I froze. My grandmother, the woman who had guided me through every major moment of my life, was seated like an afterthought, not beside my parents, not anywhere she could see clearly. She looked small in that crowd, and the sight of it cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to stop everything. I wanted to walk over and take her hand and move her to the front where she belonged. But the music swelled, the doors opened, and all eyes turned toward me. I walked down the aisle with a smile that felt glued to my face, my heart breaking in quiet pieces with every step. From where she sat, Grandma had to lean to catch a glimpse of me. Our eyes met for just a second. She smiled the same gentle smile she had always given me, as if to tell me it was all right. That hurt more than anything else. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Vows were exchanged. Applause followed. Cameras flashed. People stood and cheered. Through it all, I was acutely aware of who was missing from the center of my experience. At the reception, the pattern continued. Grandma was placed at a table near the edge of the room, surrounded by distant relatives she barely knew. My parents circulated confidently, greeting guests, accepting congratulations. Sophie moved easily between groups, radiant and relaxed. No one asked where Grandma preferred to sit. No one asked if she was comfortable. When I tried to pull up a chair beside her, my mother intercepted me with a light laugh, telling me guests wanted photos that we could talk later. Every attempt I made to linger was gently redirected. I watched as Sophie leaned in to speak for Grandma, answering questions before she could. I saw my father pat Grandma's shoulder briefly before moving on as if checking off a task. I saw how people looked at her confused about her place, unsure whether she mattered as much as everyone else in the immediate family. During the speeches, the exclusion became impossible to ignore. Toast after toast was given. My parents spoke. Sophie spoke. Friends spoke. Stories were shared, laughter filled the room. I waited for someone to invite Grandma to say a few words. She had known me longer than anyone there. She had stories that mattered. No one asked. When someone finally mentioned her, it was in passing, framed as gratitude for being there. She nodded politely, her smile tight but gracious. I felt a surge of anger I had to swallow down with my champagne. Later, when the music started and people took to the dance floor, I searched for her again. She sat alone, watching from a distance, her hands clasped around a glass of water. Couples spun under the lights. Laughter echoed. I danced once with my partner, then excused myself, determined to make my way back to her. Before I could reach her, Sophie stepped into my path. She told me Grandma was tired, that it might be best to let her rest. She said it kindly, but there was a firmness underneath that felt rehearsed. I looked past her and saw my parents watching, their expressions carefully neutral. I didn't argue. I nodded and let myself be guided away, my chest aching with the weight of what I was allowing. Near the end of the night, I finally managed to sit beside Grandma for a few quiet minutes. The room buzzed around us, but she seemed far away from it all. I apologized for not being there more. She squeezed my hand and told me not to worry, that she was proud of me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something else. Not sadness, awareness. As she stood to leave, I noticed she didn't have a ride of her own. My father told me he and Sophie would take her home. It felt wrong, but the day had worn me down. I kissed her cheek and promised to call her the next day. She looked at me for a long moment before she left, as if memorizing my face. After the guests began to drift away and the lights dimmed, I felt hollow. The joy everyone talked about seemed distant, unreachable. I told myself I was exhausted, that emotions ran high on days like this. Still, a quiet dread settled in my stomach as I drove home. The next morning, I called Grandma. It went to voicemail. I left a message light and cheerful, asking how she was feeling. She didn't call back. I tried again in the afternoon. Sophie answered instead. She told me Grandma was resting and that she'd pass along the message. Days passed. Each time I reached out, there was an excuse. Grandma was sleeping. Grandma was at an appointment. Grandma didn't feel like talking. When I finally spoke to my mother directly, she delivered the sentence that changed everything. She told me Grandma needed space from me. She said it gently, as if it were a kindness. She said it was for the best. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, replaying the wedding in my mind. The seating, the interruptions, the way decisions had been made without asking. It all aligned with brutal clarity. The wedding hadn't brought us together. It had been the moment they made their move public. By pushing Grandma to the margins that day, they had shown me exactly where they thought she belonged. And by cutting me off immediately afterward, they made it clear they believed I would accept it. They were wrong. But at that moment, standing alone in my kitchen, I didn't yet know how I would respond. I only knew that the exclusion hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, and whatever they were planning next, it was already in motion. The silence after the wedding was heavier than anything that had happened before. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, just an absence that settled into my days and refused to leave. I woke up expecting to see Grandma Evelyn's name on my phone, a short message asking how married life felt or reminding me to eat breakfast. Instead, there was nothing. At first, I told myself she was tired. The wedding had been long. The travel alone could wear anyone out, especially at her age. I sent a gentle text, then another the next day. Both went unanswered. When I called, it rang until voicemail. The message I left sounded too cheerful, like I was trying to convince myself more than her. By the third day, I realized something was wrong. Every attempt to reach her ended the same way. Either no response or Sophie answering with that careful, soothing voice that made my skin crawl. Grandma was resting. Grandma had stepped out. Grandma didn't feel like talking today. It was the way Sophie said it that bothered me, not worried, not uncertain, certain. As if she knew exactly what Grandma felt wanted and needed, even though Grandma herself wasn't saying any of it. On the fourth day, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. We exchanged polite greetings between the produce and the dairy aisle, the way strangers do when they don't want to draw attention. I asked her casually if she'd heard from Grandma. She smiled and said, "Oh, she's fine. She's just enjoying some quiet time." You know how she is. I did know how she was. And quiet time had never meant cutting off the person she spoke to almost daily. That was the moment the lie began to take shape in my mind. A few days later, I overheard my mother talking on the phone while I was at my parents' house picking up something I'd left behind. She didn't know I was there yet. Her voice carried down the hallway, soft but clear. "Claire's been very busy since the wedding," she said. "New life, new priorities, it's normal." I stood frozen, my keys still in my hand. Busy, new priorities. The words sounded harmless, even generous, but they weren't true. I hadn't pulled away. I had been pushed. When she saw me, she ended the call quickly and smiled, asking if I needed anything. I didn't confront her. I couldn't yet. Instead, I nodded and left my chest tight with the realization that something was being rewritten quietly, deliberately. Over the next week, the story spread. Sophie told a neighbor she'd run into that I was settling into married life and didn't visit much anymore. A family friend mentioned offhandedly that they heard I was giving Grandma some space. Every time I heard a new version, my stomach dropped. They were planting a narrative, one where I was distant, one where Grandma was lonely but cared for, one where my absence was a choice. And slowly, painfully, it began to work. The only direct conversation I had with Grandma during that time came unexpectedly. My phone rang late one afternoon, and when I saw her name, my heart leapt. I answered immediately, my voice already breaking with relief. "Grandma." There was a pause. Then her voice softer than usual, more cautious. "Hello, dear." I launched into apologies I didn't owe, telling her I'd been trying to reach her, asking if she was feeling all right. She listened quietly. When I finished, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You're very busy now," she said. "I don't want to bother you." It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it, like the words didn't belong to her, like they had been placed there by someone else. Before I could respond, I heard a faint voice in the background. Sophie, whispering. Not loud enough to understand, but close enough to be unmistakable. Claire, Grandma said, her tone suddenly careful. "I should go. We'll talk another time." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, my hands shaking. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was control. For the first time, the fear that had been circling my thoughts landed fully. What if they succeeded in convincing her I didn't care? What if the person who had always trusted me now believed I had abandoned her? That night I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every interaction from the past month, every redirected conversation, every interrupted sentence. The pieces fit together too neatly to ignore. A few days later, I stopped by my parents' house, unannounced again, driven by equal parts desperation and instinct. Sophie was there sitting at the kitchen table with Grandma's purse beside her. Grandma herself was in the living room watching television with the sound turned low. I noticed immediately that Sophie answered when I asked how Grandma was doing. Grandma nodded along, smiling faintly, but said nothing. On the coffee table, I saw a folder I didn't recognize. It was thicker than medical paperwork, bound neatly with crisp edges. When I asked what it was, Sophie closed it without hesitation and said it was nothing important. Nothing important. Later, as I helped Grandma to the bathroom, I asked quietly if everything was okay. She hesitated, then nodded. But her eyes darted toward the hallway, toward the kitchen where Sophie and my parents were talking in low voices. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said softly. Those words hit me harder than any accusation could have. Grandma Evelyn had never been afraid of trouble. She had always believed that discomfort was sometimes necessary for truth. Hearing her say that told me exactly how much pressure she was under. That evening, as I was leaving, I heard my father say something to Sophie that confirmed everything I feared. Once everything is settled, he said it'll be easier for her. Settled. The word echoed in my head all the way home. Settled meant decided, finalized, out of her hands. I began to understand that this wasn't just about separating me from my grandmother emotionally. It was about removing her ability to choose, about narrowing her world until the only voices she heard belonged to them. The fear sharpened into clarity. They weren't just lying about me. They were preparing to act on something much larger. I didn't yet know what that something was. But I knew it involved paperwork authority and decisions being made for her own good. I had seen those phrases before. I had seen what they could justify. That night, I sat in my living room long after the sun went down, the house quiet around me. I realized that if they succeeded, there might come a day when Grandma Evelyn truly wouldn't be able to speak freely to me. When every word would be filtered, every choice managed, every connection monitored. And if that happened, no amount of confrontation after the fact would undo it. They weren't just taking me away from Grandma. They were taking Grandma away from herself. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped hoping things would resolve on their own. Hope was no longer enough. Whatever they were planning, I had to see her alone again. I had to hear the truth from her, not from the story being told around her. Because somewhere beneath the lies and the forced smiles, there was a reason my family was moving so quickly. And I was starting to understand that the reason had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. I didn't tell anyone I was going to see Grandma Evelyn that morning. I didn't text. I didn't call ahead. I learned quickly that anything shared traveled fast and arrived twisted. Instead, I drove across town early, before routines tightened around her day, before someone could decide she was too tired to talk. Her house looked the same as it always had, quiet and dignified curtains, half drawn to let in the soft morning light. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her face changed in a way I will never forget. Relief flickered first, then caution, and finally determination. "You came alone," she said, not as a question. I nodded. She stepped aside and let me in, locking the door behind me with deliberate care. That simple action told me everything. We sat at the small kitchen table where we had shared countless cups of tea over the years. She poured slowly, hand-steady movements precise. Whatever my family believed about her fragility, it wasn't reflected in the woman sitting across from me now. "They think I don't see what they're doing," she said quietly before I could even speak. The words settled between us like a confession. I felt something inside me loosen a knot I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I wasn't imagining it. She knew. I told her everything. The unanswered calls, the stories I'd overheard, the way Sophie spoke for her, the folder on the coffee table. I told her about the phone call, about hearing Sophie whisper in the background while Grandma sounded like a guest in her own life. She listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "They've been careful," she said. "Not cruel, not openly. That's how they think they'll get away with it." She told me about the changes I hadn't seen, how her phone was often misplaced and handed back later, how appointments were scheduled for her and explained after the fact, how conversations were framed to make her doubt herself just enough to hesitate. "They talk about safety," she said, "about how complicated things are at my age, about how they worry I'll make a mistake." Her mouth curved into a faint, humorless smile. "They don't worry about mistakes. They worry about decisions." The truth of that landed hard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached for a thin folder tucked neatly beside the table, one I hadn't noticed before. She didn't open it right away. She just rested her hand on it, as if grounding herself. "There's something you need to know," she said. I felt my pulse quicken. "I didn't tell you before because I didn't want you to carry it," she continued. "And I didn't tell them because I wanted to see who they would be when they thought there was nothing to gain." She opened the folder and slid a document toward me. I scanned the first page, then the second, my breath catching as the words registered. Land deed. Montana, 2,400 acres. I looked up at her stunned. She watched my face carefully as if measuring the impact. It's family land, she said, passed down quietly. It's been in my name for years. The figure listed near the bottom made my vision blur. $30 million. I sat back, the weight of it pressing down on me all at once. The sudden urgency, the sudden control, the sudden lies, everything snapped into focus. That land isn't money to them, she said softly. It's control. She explained that she had kept it private intentionally, not hidden illegally, just unannounced. She wanted to live her life without being treated like an asset. She wanted to see who showed up without expecting a reward. They've always known there was something, she said. They just didn't know how much. That uncertainty makes people impatient. I understood then why they were moving so fast, why the pressure was escalating, why the paperwork felt rushed. She looked at me across the table, her expression firm. I chose you? I swallowed hard. Not because you're perfect, she said, but because you never tried to manage me. You asked, you listened, you respected my right to decide. My throat tightened. I didn't want them turning you into a target, she added. If they knew what was at stake, they would have come for you sooner. That realization sent a chill through me. The lies weren't just about protecting her. They were about isolating me before I could understand my position. We went back over everything with new clarity, the scheduling, the narratives, the paperwork. It all pointed toward a single goal: strip her of authority before she could act on her own terms. They don't know the full scope, she said. Not yet. A part of me wanted to confront my parents immediately, to demand explanations, to put the truth on the table and watch them scramble. Grandma shook her head gently when I voiced the thought. If we move too fast, she said, they'll move faster. She explained that silence chosen deliberately could be a shield. That resistance too early would tip them off and push them to escalate before we were ready. We don't tell them, she said firmly. Not about the land, not about what I plan to do. I nodded, understanding the strategy, even as my emotions surged. We observe, she continued. We document. And we prepare. It was strange sitting there with her discussing tactics like allies instead of granddaughter and grandmother. But it felt right. It felt balanced. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel helpless. I felt responsible, trusted. As I stood to leave, she took my hand, her grip stronger than anyone would have guessed. Whatever happens, she said, remember this. Silence isn't surrender, it's positioning. I drove home with the weight of the truth riding beside me. The woman my family thought they could control had been watching them all along. And the inheritance they were circling wasn't just land or money. It was the power to choose what came next. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing was clear. My family wasn't just targeting my grandmother. They were targeting my future. And now that I knew what was really at stake, I wasn't going to let them decide either of our lives for us. Silence changed shape the moment it became a choice. Before, it had felt like something imposed on me, a wall built by other people's decisions. After that morning with Grandma Evelyn, it became something else entirely. A strategy. A way to stay one step ahead of a family that believed I was still confused, still emotional, still easy to manage. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't demand answers from Sophie. I didn't even hint that I knew more than they thought. Instead, I stepped back into the role they expected. The busy newlywed, the daughter who trusted their judgment, the granddaughter who didn't ask too many questions anymore. They mistook my calm for ignorance. The first call I made after leaving Grandma's house wasn't to my husband or a friend. It was to an attorney named Jennifer Lee. Grandma had mentioned her once years earlier in passing as someone who understood both family dynamics and the law. I didn't explain everything on the phone. I just said I needed advice about protecting an elderly relative's autonomy. Jennifer asked a few careful questions, then told me to come in. Her office was quiet and unassuming, the kind of place that didn't advertise power, but held plenty of it. She listened without interrupting as I laid out the pattern. The isolation, the pressure, the paperwork, the subtle rewriting of reality. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "This isn't a family disagreement," she said. "This is elder financial exploitation in its early stages." Hearing it named so clearly sent a jolt through me. It confirmed what my instincts had been screaming for weeks. Jennifer explained how these situations usually unfolded: emotional isolation first, then doubt, then urgency, finally, paperwork framed as protection. The moment they sense resistance, she warned, they accelerate. Together we built a plan, quietly, carefully. Jennifer began setting up legal safeguards around Grandma's assets without alerting anyone who didn't need to know. A trust that protected ownership. Clear documentation of intent. Boundaries that would make it impossible for anyone to claim authority without consequences. Everything was done discreetly. No letters sent to my parents' address. No changes that would trigger questions. Jennifer emphasized that timing mattered as much as preparation. "They think they're winning," she said. "Let them." I went back to my family exactly as they expected me to be. When my mother called to check in, I sounded distracted but agreeable. When Sophie texted about Grandma's schedule, I thanked her for keeping me informed. When my father mentioned taking care of things so Grandma wouldn't have to worry, I nodded and said I trusted them. It felt wrong at first, playing along while knowing the truth. But every day their confidence grew, and with it, their carelessness. They started saying more, moving faster, letting things slip. Sophie began mentioning appointments that hadn't existed before. My mother talked about simplifying responsibilities. My father used phrases like finalizing and settling as if the outcome were already decided. None of them asked what Grandma wanted. None of them asked what I thought. They didn't need to. They believed they were in control. I kept notes, dates, words, who said what and when. Jennifer had advised me to document everything, not because I needed it yet, but because patterns mattered more than single moments. Grandma did the same in her own way. She remembered conversations with astonishing clarity, recounting them later with exact phrasing. "They underestimate memory when it doesn't serve them," she told me once. The most surprising part of that week was watching Grandma shift from being protected to being strategic. She stopped pushing back in small ways and leaned into the image they had created for her. She asked them to repeat explanations. She expressed confusion at convenient moments. She thanked them for their concern. It made them bold. My father called one afternoon and mentioned that they were thinking of bringing in a professional to help streamline things. He said it casually, like a favor. When I asked what kind of professional, he hesitated before saying a notary. That single word confirmed everything. Jennifer had predicted it. Notaries were often used to legitimize rushed decisions, especially when the narrative of incapacity had already been planted. The fact that they were preparing one meant they believed Grandma was ready to sign. I relayed the information to Jennifer immediately. Her response was swift and calm. "Good," she said. "That means they're ready to show their hand." She began coordinating with an investigator who specialized in cases involving elder abuse. Nothing formal yet, just preparation, just readiness. The kind that only mattered if things went exactly where we thought they would. Meanwhile, the pressure increased. Sophie's messages became more frequent. My mother talked about timelines. My father mentioned how important it was not to delay while everything was still clear. Clear. The word made me sick every time I heard it. Clear for whom? One evening after a particularly tense conversation, I sat alone in my living room and felt the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about identity. About whether my grandmother would be seen as a person or a problem to be managed. About whether I would be treated as family or as an obstacle. I thought about confronting them, about how satisfying it might feel to expose everything immediately. But I also thought about what Grandma had said. About positioning. About letting people reveal themselves fully before holding them accountable. So I stayed silent. That silence gave them confidence, and confidence made them sloppy. A few days later, Sophie let it slip that the notary's schedule was tight. My father said they should aim to get things done soon. My mother mentioned how relieved she would be once the paperwork was handled. Handled. I could feel the storm building. I could feel the moment approaching when they would arrive with smiles and documents expecting gratitude and compliance. That night, Grandma and I sat together drinking tea, the house quiet around us. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "They think the next visit will end this," she said. I met her gaze steady and sure. "It will," I replied. "Just not the way they expect." For the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to peace. Not because the danger had passed, but because I was no longer reacting to it. I was ready. They believed silence meant surrender. They were about to learn it meant preparation. The day they brought the papers arrived quietly wrapped in polite voices and practiced concern. My father called that morning, his tone unusually gentle, and said they wanted to stop by to help Grandma Evelyn simplify a few things. He spoke as if this were a favor, something generous, something long overdue. I agreed without hesitation, my voice calm, even grateful. When I hung up, my hands were steady. Grandma was already dressed when I arrived at her house, sitting in her usual chair by the window. She looked smaller than she used to, not because she was weak, but because she had learned how to make herself look that way when it served a purpose. When I asked if she was ready, she nodded once and said quietly, "Let them talk." They arrived exactly on time. My parents walked in first, smiling, carrying the confidence of people who believed they were about to close a deal. Sophie followed, holding a thick folder against her chest like something precious. They kissed Grandma's cheek, asked how she was feeling, commented on the weather. Everything about their behavior suggested normalcy, routine care. Then my father placed the folder on the coffee table and said, "We just want to go over a few things with you, Mom. Nothing complicated." Nothing complicated was their favorite phrase. It meant complicated enough that no one wanted to argue. They sat close to Grandma, creating a small circle around her. Sophie opened the folder, carefully smoothing the pages as if preparing a presentation. My mother leaned forward, her voice soft and reassuring. She talked about peace of mind, about avoiding future stress, about making sure everything was taken care of while Grandma was still feeling well. I listened silent, watching every movement. The language was deliberate. No one said control. No one said ownership. They said help. They said safety. They said family responsibility. Sophie slid the first document forward and began explaining it in simple terms, speaking slowly the way people do when they assume confusion. She pointed to sections and summarized instead of reading. She emphasized how convenient it would be, how much easier things would become once decisions didn't have to be made repeatedly. When Grandma asked what would happen if she changed her mind, Sophie smiled and said it was standard, that everything was flexible. She didn't answer directly. She never did. I asked a question, then my voice intentionally hesitant. I asked whether any of this could be undone if Grandma decided she wanted to handle things herself again. My father answered, instead of Sophie telling me there were protections in place, that the details weren't something we needed to worry about. That was when I noticed what they weren't saying. There were no clear limits, no expiration, no mention of restoring authority. The document wasn't designed to help Grandma manage her life. It was designed to remove her from it. Grandma leaned back in her chair and sighed softly, playing her part perfectly. She said the paperwork made her head spin. She said legal language confused her. Sophie immediately leaned in, offering to handle everything, to explain only what mattered. My mother nodded, telling Grandma she didn't need to stress herself over details. My father added that this was exactly why they were doing it now, while things were still clear. Clear. The word landed like a threat, disguised as kindness. I watched Grandma's hands tremble slightly as she reached toward the papers. Not from fear, but from effort. She was choosing when to appear uncertain, and it was working. The more unsure she seemed, the more confident they became. Sophie began summarizing faster, skipping sections entirely. My father glanced at his watch once, then again. My mother reassured Grandma that they could take their time, even as her tone suggested the opposite. I realized then that this wasn't their final move. This was a test. They were gauging resistance, measuring how much pressure it would take. Grandma said she needed time to think. The room shifted immediately. My parents exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long. Sophie's smile tightened just barely. My father said he understood, but that it would be better not to delay too much. He mentioned how difficult it was to schedule professionals, how timing mattered. My mother added that waiting could complicate things unnecessarily. They left the folder behind when they left a gesture meant to look generous. To me, it felt like a warning. After the door closed, the house felt heavier. Grandma and I sat in silence for a long moment. Then she looked at me and said, "They think I'm ready." "They think they're done," I replied. I gathered the papers carefully, sliding them back into the folder without changing their order. I didn't need to read them again. I already knew what they represented. That evening, my phone buzzed with messages. Sophie checking in, my mother asking how Grandma was feeling, my father reminding us that they were only trying to help. Each message carried the same undertone: hurry, decide, sign. I responded politely and vaguely, thanking them for their concern, telling them we were reviewing things. Every word I sent reinforced their belief that the process was still moving in their favor. Later that night, I called Jennifer Lee and told her everything. She listened carefully, then said exactly what I expected. "They're not finished," she said. "They'll come back. And next time they'll bring someone with authority. A notary." The thought made my stomach tighten, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The moment we had been preparing for was approaching. The moment when everything hidden would be forced into the open. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Sophie mentioned the notary's availability. My mother talked about finalizing plans. My father said it would be easier for everyone once things were settled. Settled meant signed. Signed meant irreversible. Grandma continued to act uncertain, asking questions, expressing fatigue. Each performance made them more confident. They didn't see the quiet resolve beneath her words. They didn't see how carefully she was watching them. I documented everything. Times, phrases, repeated arguments. Jennifer advised me to keep every message, every voicemail. Patterns mattered, and the pattern was becoming unmistakable. By the end of the week, my father called again and said they would stop by soon with someone to help make everything official. His voice carried relief, the kind that comes when people believe resistance has faded. After I hung up, I sat with Grandma in the living room, the folder of papers still untouched on the table between us. She reached across and took my hand. "They've shown us who they are," she said. "And they've shown us how far they're willing to go," I replied. She nodded once her grip firm. "Then we'll be ready." As I drove home that night, I understood something with absolute clarity. The papers they brought weren't meant to protect her. They were meant to break her authority quietly, politely, without witnesses. They had shown their hand. And now it was our turn. I stopped playing small the moment I realized this was no longer just about money. It was about whether my grandmother would be allowed to remain a person or be reduced to a signature. The papers they had left behind sat on the coffee table like a quiet threat, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear when I looked at them. I felt clarity. After my parents left that day, Grandma Evelyn and I didn't rush to talk. We sat in the living room with the television muted, the late afternoon light stretching across the carpet. She watched the dust drift in the air like she was measuring time itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "They think I'm ready to hand my life over," she said. "They think you're alone," I replied. She turned to me, her eyes sharp, not tired, not confused. "I'm not." That was the moment everything shifted. I called Jennifer Lee as soon as I got home. I didn't soften anything. I told her exactly what had happened, how the papers were framed, how urgency was creeping into every conversation, how a notary was being mentioned more often. She listened, asked for specifics, then said the words I needed to hear. "This is escalation," she said, "and it's predictable." She explained that what we were seeing was the final phase before coercion. They believed the groundwork had been laid, the narrative was in place. All that was left was to formalize control under the guise of care. "Do not refuse outright," Jennifer advised. "Refusal tips them off. We want them to come back thinking they're in charge. Let them come back." Those words felt counterintuitive, but they made sense. Every step we had taken quietly had given us leverage. If we confronted them too early, they would retreat and regroup. If we stayed calm, they would reveal more. That night I sat at my desk and wrote everything down. Dates, phrases, who spoke first, who interrupted, which words were repeated. Peace of mind, safety, simplify, finalize. Every sentence that sounded caring but removed choice. Grandma did the same in her own way. She didn't write anything down, but she remembered. She recalled conversations word for word, even the pauses. She noticed how Sophie leaned in closer when papers were discussed, how my father avoided eye contact when deadlines were mentioned, how my mother smiled when Grandma hesitated. They assume age equals fog, Grandma said. It doesn't. Over the next few days, the calls increased. Sophie texted twice a day asking if Grandma had questions. My mother dropped off food without asking, staying just long enough to remind Grandma how relieved everyone would be once things were settled. My father spoke about timing, about availability, about how difficult it was to coordinate professionals. The word notary appeared in almost every conversation. I played my part carefully. I responded politely. I asked neutral questions. I thanked them for their help. I never said no. I never said yes. I let the tension stretch. Jennifer coordinated quietly behind the scenes. She prepared documents that protected Grandma's assets regardless of what my family attempted. She reached out to an investigator who specialized in cases involving elder exploitation, someone who understood how these situations unfolded and how easily they were dismissed when no one intervened early. We don't accuse, Jennifer said. We observe. And when the moment comes, we document. The hardest part wasn't the strategy. It was the waiting. Knowing my family was planning to remove my grandmother's autonomy and choosing not to stop them immediately went against every instinct I had. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look on Grandma's face when she locked the door behind me the morning she told me the truth. She wasn't afraid, she was prepared. Midweek, my father called with a tone that was almost cheerful. He said they had found a time when everyone could be present. He said a professional would be joining us to make things easier. He said it would be good to have everything resolved soon. Resolved. After I hung up, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel. This was it. The moment we had been anticipating. The visit where they would expect compliance, gratitude, and signatures. That evening, Grandma surprised me. As we sat together drinking tea, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a small recorder, the kind people used to bring to lectures years ago. I found this while cleaning, she said casually. Still works. I stared at her, stunned. They underestimate me because I let them, she continued. If they want to explain things to me again, I want to remember exactly how they do it. I laughed softly, a mix of admiration and relief. She wasn't just participating in the plan. She was leading it. We tested the recorder. It worked perfectly. She practiced placing it discreetly. She even joked about how technology had finally caught up with her patients. The next day, Sophie slipped up. She texted me that the notary's schedule was tight and that it would be best if Grandma didn't change her mind at the last minute. She deleted the message quickly, but not before I saw it. I saved the screenshot. Jennifer nodded when I showed it to her. They're getting nervous, she said. Nervous people rush. By Friday, everything felt taut. My parents called twice in one day. Sophie stopped pretending she wasn't managing the situation. My mother mentioned how hard it was for them to worry about Grandma's future. My father talked about relief. Relief for whom? That night, Grandma and I took a short walk around her block. The air was cool, the street quiet. She moved slower than she used to, but her posture was upright, her steps deliberate. I want you to know something, she said as we passed the old oak tree she loved. No matter how this ends, I don't regret staying silent. Neither do I replied. She stopped walking and looked at me fully then. If they had respected me, none of this would have been necessary. I understood what she meant. Silence had not created this conflict. Disrespect had. When I left that night, I felt an unfamiliar calm. Not because I believed my family would suddenly change, but because I was ready to see them clearly. ready to hear what they would say when they believed no one was stopping them. Jennifer called me just before bed to confirm arrangements. The investigator would be available. Everything was in place. "Let them come," she said again. The house was quiet after I hung up. I thought about my parents, about how certain they must feel, how confident in the story they had built. I thought about Sophie, about the role she had chosen. And I thought about the papers on the coffee table waiting for a pen that wouldn't come. The next visit, they believed, would end this. They were right. Just not in the way they imagined. The doorbell rang just after noon, sharp and confident, like someone who expected to be welcomed. I was already there, standing a few feet behind Grandma Evelyn's chair, my heart steady in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. She sat upright, hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the quiet resolve in her eyes. But no one ever looked closely when they thought the ending was already written. My father stepped inside first, smiling, as if this were a social visit. My mother followed, carrying a tote bag filled with documents she pretended were harmless. Sophie came next, her posture tight with anticipation. And behind them walked a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed, holding a leather briefcase like a badge of authority. "This is the notary," Sophie said brightly, as if introducing a family friend. The notary nodded politely. He spoke with the ease of someone used to rooms like this, rooms where people felt pressured to be agreeable. He said he was there to help streamline the process, to make sure everything was done properly. He said it like a favor. They sat down without waiting to be invited. Papers were placed on the table with careful precision. My father cleared his throat and spoke first, his tone, gentle, almost proud. "We're just here to finish what we started," he said. "So Mom can finally relax. Relax." The notary opened his briefcase and removed a stack of forms, a seal and a pen, placing them neatly in front of Grandma. The pen gleamed under the light like it was something important, something final. My mother leaned in. "We know this has been confusing," she said softly. "But this will make everything easier." Sophie nodded, taking over the explanation before Grandma could respond. She summarized again, skipping over details, pointing where signatures would go. She spoke slowly, patiently, the way people do when they believe they are the smartest person in the room. Grandma asked what would happen if she changed her mind. The notary answered instead of my family, his words vague, reassuring, without being specific. He spoke about protections and best practices, about how these arrangements were common. Common for whom? When the pen was placed directly in front of Grandma, the room went quiet. Everyone leaned in just slightly, as if proximity might influence her decision. Sophie smiled. My father folded his hands. My mother watched Grandma's face closely, waiting for hesitation. Grandma reached for the pen, her hand trembling just enough to confirm their expectations. That was when I spoke. "I have a question," I said calmly. All heads turned toward me, surprise flickering across their faces. They had forgotten I was there. I asked the notary if the agreement could be revoked easily if Grandma decided she wanted full control back. He hesitated, glancing at my father before answering. His response was careful, technical, and ultimately evasive. Sophie frowned. My mother sighed. My father said we didn't need to get into hypotheticals. "That's exactly when hypotheticals matter," I replied. The notary cleared his throat and suggested moving forward. He slid the document closer to Grandma again. Before she could touch it, there was another knock at the door. This one was slower, firmer. Everyone froze. "I wasn't expecting anyone else," the notary said, irritation breaking through his professional tone. "I was," Grandma said quietly. I opened the door. Standing there were Jennifer Lee and an investigator from the county, both holding identification, both calm in the way people are when they know exactly why they're present. "Good afternoon," Jennifer said. "I represent Evelyn Anderson." The room changed instantly. My father stood up too quickly. My mother's face drained of color. Sophie clutched the edge of the table. The notary snapped his briefcase shut, his movements suddenly less confident. The investigator introduced himself and explained that he was there to observe and document due to concerns about potential elder financial exploitation. His voice was neutral, factual, impossible to argue with without looking defensive. Jennifer looked at the papers on the table. Before anything is signed, she said, "My client has the right to independent counsel and full understanding of the consequences." The notary began to speak, but the investigator raised a hand. "I'd like to ask a few questions first," he said. He asked who had prepared the documents. Sophie answered, then corrected herself and said the family had arranged it. He asked who requested the notary. My father said it was a group decision. He asked whether Grandma had asked for this arrangement herself. No one answered immediately. Grandma looked up, then her voice steady, clear, nothing like the confusion they had relied on. "I did not," she said. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The investigator nodded and began taking notes. He asked about the pressure to sign, about the urgency, about the repeated framing of incapacity. With each question, the story my family had built began to unravel. The notary shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence gone. Sophie tried to explain, her voice sharp, now defensive. My mother reached for Grandma's hand, but Grandma pulled away. Jennifer placed a recorder on the table and pressed play. The room filled with familiar voices repeating the same phrases. Safety, simplify. Don't worry about details, let us handle it. My father's face flushed. Sophie stared at the floor. This meeting is being documented, the investigator said calmly. And at this point I'm concerned about coercion. The notary stood abruptly, saying there must have been a misunderstanding. The investigator asked him to remain seated. Jennifer met my gaze briefly, then turned to Grandma. There's something else you wanted to share, she said. Grandma nodded. She reached for a folder I had placed beside her chair earlier that morning. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and slid a document across the table. This is the deed to my family ranch in Montana, she said. Approximately 2,400 acres. My father's mouth fell open. Sophie looked up sharply. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. Jennifer continued, her voice calm. The property is valued in the range of $30 million, excluding additional assets. The room went utterly silent. Grandma looked at each of them in turn. I kept this private to see who would respect my choices when they thought there was nothing to gain, she said. Now I know. The notary sank back into his chair. The investigator documented everything. Sophie's composure finally cracked her face, twisting with shock and anger. My father tried to speak, to explain, to reframe. Jennifer stopped him gently but firmly. This meeting is over, she said. Any further communication should go through counsel. The investigator stood and thanked Grandma for her cooperation. He looked at my family with measured seriousness and explained next steps, the words consequences and review hanging in the air. They left in silence, no smiles, no confidence, no authority. When the door closed behind them, Grandma let out a long breath and leaned back in her chair. She reached for my hand and squeezed it once. They thought they were finishing this, she said quietly. They didn't realize they were exposing themselves. I looked around the room at the untouched pen, the scattered papers, the illusion of control lying in pieces on the table. The storm had finally broken, and for the first time since it began, the air felt clear. The house felt different after they left, as if the walls themselves had released a breath they'd been holding for years. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was clean. Grandma Evelyn stayed seated for a long moment, her hand still resting on the arm of the chair, her eyes fixed on the door, as if replaying every second that had just passed. They didn't even say goodbye, she murmured. Not with sadness, but with a strange kind of clarity. They didn't come here as family, I replied. They came as negotiators. That afternoon, Jennifer stayed with us, carefully collecting the documents that had been brought, photographing everything that mattered, and explaining what would happen next. The investigator had already begun his report. There would be follow-ups, interviews, requests for clarification. Nothing dramatic yet, but the kind of slow, methodical process that couldn't be undone by excuses or rewritten stories. They were counting on you staying quiet, Jennifer told Grandma. Now the silence belongs to them. By evening, the phone started ringing. My mother called first. I didn't answer. Sophie texted, then called. My father left a voicemail that was short and unsteady, asking if we could talk, saying there had been misunderstandings. I didn't respond. Jennifer had advised us not to engage directly, and more than that, neither Grandma nor I had anything left to explain. Everything important had already been said in that living room. The next few days unfolded slowly, but the effects were immediate. My parents' certainty evaporated. Their messages shifted in tone from authority to confusion, from confidence to self-protection. Sophie's texts became defensive, filled with justifications that contradicted each other. Grandma read them once, then handed the phone back to me. I don't need to hear apologies that arrive only after exposure, she said. A formal letter arrived midweek, drafted by a lawyer my parents had hired in a hurry. It spoke about intentions, misunderstandings, concern for well-being. Jennifer read it carefully and smiled without humor. This is damage control, she said, not remorse. She drafted a response that was brief and firm, stating that all communication would now go through counsel, and that any further attempts to pressure or misrepresent Grandma's wishes would be documented. That ended the calls. The fallout extended beyond phone screens. Neighbors started asking careful questions. Extended relatives reached out, their curiosity thinly veiled. News traveled fast when authority collapsed. The story being whispered wasn't the one my parents wanted. It wasn't about concern. It was about control. Sophie stopped showing up at Grandma's house entirely. My parents drove by once slowly, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something that might reassure them. Grandma watched from the window and didn't wave. In the weeks that followed, we focused on rebuilding something quieter and stronger. Jennifer finalized the trust arrangements, ensuring Grandma's assets were protected, and that her intentions were clear and legally unassailable. The ranch in Montana was placed into the trust with explicit instructions. Everything was documented. Everything was deliberate. One afternoon, as we sat reviewing paperwork, Grandma looked up at me and said, "I should have done this sooner." "You did it when it mattered," I replied. She smiled then, a real smile unburdened by performance. I wanted to believe they loved me enough not to try. That wasn't weakness, I said. That was hope. The investigator followed up with additional questions, requesting timelines and clarifications. Grandma answered everything herself. Her voice never wavered. The idea that she was confused or incapable dissolved quickly under scrutiny. By the end of the month, it was clear there would be consequences. Not dramatic arrests or headlines, but professional repercussions. The notary who had accompanied my family was under review. His involvement in similar situations was being examined. Jennifer said it was likely his license would be suspended, possibly revoked. They don't usually lose everything, she explained, but they lose the ability to do this again. That mattered to Grandma more than anything. My relationship with my parents changed permanently, not in a single argument, but in a quiet understanding that trust, once broken at this level, didn't regenerate on command. My father sent one final message asking to meet alone. Grandma considered it for a long moment, then declined. "Not now," she said. "If he wants reconciliation, he can start by respecting my boundaries." Sophie disappeared entirely. The last I heard, she had moved cities, perhaps hoping distance would erase what proximity had exposed. What surprised me most was how quickly peace replaced chaos. Without constant pressure, Grandma slept better. She started gardening again. She asked me to help her plan a trip to Montana, something she had put off for years because it felt safer not to think too far ahead. When we finally stood on the porch of the ranch together weeks later, watching the land stretch out under the open sky, she took my hand and said, "This is what they were trying to take from me. Not just property, time." The decision she made there wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of everything she had seen and endured. She told Jennifer to proceed with transferring full stewardship of the ranch to me exactly as she had planned, not as a reward, not as a shield, but as a continuation. "You'll protect it," she said, "and you'll protect yourself." I felt the weight of that trust settle into something solid and grounding. But the story didn't end with legal victories or broken alliances. It changed shape. Grandma began receiving calls from women she barely knew, women who had heard what happened through quiet channels, daughters, nieces, friends of friends, all asking the same questions in different voices. What do I do if my family won't listen? What if they say it's for my own good? How do I know when help becomes control? Grandma listened to every one of them. She told her story without embellishment, without anger, just facts, just truth. Soon the ranch wasn't just land. It became a place of refuge, a quiet gathering spot where women could sit at a long table and speak freely without being corrected, interrupted, or managed. Jennifer volunteered her time. The investigator connected us with resources. Word spread. One afternoon, as I watched Grandma pour tea for a woman whose hands shook with exhaustion and fear, I realized something profound. This wasn't just Grandma reclaiming her dignity. This was her redefining legacy. She wasn't leaving behind wealth. She was leaving behind permission. Permission to say no, permission to ask questions, permission to remain whole at any age. That night, as the sun set over the fields, Grandma turned to me and said, "I spent years worrying about what I'd leave you." I shook my head. "You already did." She smiled, looking out at the land she had protected in silence for so long. Then it was worth waiting. The family that tried to control her lost more than they anticipated. They lost access. They lost narrative. They lost the ability to define her story. And what remained was something far stronger than inheritance. It was freedom chosen deliberately and shared on her own terms. The first morning I woke up on the ranch, the silence felt different from any silence I'd known before. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of wind moving through tall grass, full of distant cattle sounds, full of a horizon that didn't end at someone else's expectations. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise slowly over land my grandmother had protected with patience most people mistake for weakness. Grandma Evelyn came out a few minutes later, wrapped in a light sweater, her hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she wanted to think clearly. She stood beside me without speaking, just breathing in the morning. For 82 years, she had learned how to survive inside other people's plans. Now she was finally standing inside her own. "They never understood this place," she said quietly. "They thought land was something you sell, not something you guard." I nodded, remembering how my parents' faces had changed the moment they realized what they had been circling. They hadn't seen history, responsibility, or continuity. They had seen leverage. Life didn't turn dramatic after that. It turned honest. The loud conflict ended, replaced by quieter, more meaningful work. Jennifer helped finalize the foundation paperwork, turning what had started as a defensive measure into something intentional. The ranch became more than property. It became a sanctuary. Women started arriving in small numbers at first. Some came with suitcases, others with nothing but questions. They sat at the long wooden table in the main house, hands wrapped around mugs of tea, voices hesitant at first. The stories were different in detail but identical in shape. Children who framed control as care, relatives who spoke about safety while stripping choice, documents explained too quickly, urgency disguised as concern. Grandma listened to every one of them. She never interrupted. She never rushed. When they finished, she didn't tell them what to do. She told them what she had learned. "That moment when you start doubting yourself," she would say. "That's the moment to pause, not comply." I watched women arrive bent by fear and leave standing straighter. Not because we fixed everything, but because we gave them language. Once you can name manipulation, it loses power. My relationship with my parents settled into something distant but clear. There were no dramatic confrontations anymore. just boundaries, firm and non-negotiable. They tried once more to reach out through a cousin, floating the idea of reconciliation. Grandma declined politely. "Forgiveness doesn't mean access," she said. Sophie never contacted us again. From what I heard, she struggled to explain why her version of events didn't match anyone else's. Silence, when it isn't chosen, can be very loud. As for me, something inside me changed permanently. I had spent most of my life shrinking to keep peace, smoothing edges so other people wouldn't feel threatened. Watching my grandmother reclaim her authority taught me that peace, built on silence, isn't peace at all. It's erasure. One afternoon, months later, we hosted a small gathering on the ranch. Not an event, just a shared meal. Women sat outside under the open sky plates, balanced on their knees, laughter breaking through stories that had once been whispered. Jennifer joined us, relaxed in a way I'd never seen her in the office. She raised her glass and smiled at Grandma. "You started something bigger than you realize," she said. Grandma shrugged lightly. "I just stopped pretending I was confused." That sentence stayed with me. How many women are labeled difficult, stubborn, or forgetful the moment they stop being convenient? How often age is used as an excuse to override autonomy? That evening, after everyone had left, I found Grandma in the old rocking chair on the porch, the same one she'd rocked me in when I was a child. I sat on the steps at her feet like I used to, the land stretching endlessly behind us. "Do you regret not telling them earlier?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "If I had, they would have behaved differently. I needed to see who they were when they thought there was nothing to gain." Her answer carried no bitterness, just truth. Time passed. The foundation grew. We partnered with advocacy groups, hosted legal workshops, connected women with resources. Stories kept coming. Some ended well, some were still in progress. But none of them were invisible anymore. On my birthday, Grandma gave me a small handwritten note. Inside, she had written just one line. "Power doesn't announce itself. It waits until you're ready to use it." I framed that note and hung it by my desk. Sometimes late at night, I think back to the moment my family walked into her living room with that notary, convinced they were finishing something. I think about how close they came to succeeding. And I think about how many people never get that interruption at the door, that moment when truth arrives just in time. That's why we keep telling these stories. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because someone listening might recognize the pattern before it's too late. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, trust that feeling. If a relative insists on managing your life for your own good, ask questions. If paperwork is rushed, pause. If silence is demanded, speak to someone who has no stake in your compliance. And if you've lived through something like this, your voice matters more than you know. Share your experience. It might be the thing that helps someone else see clearly. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Claire's place? Where do you think the line is between help and control? Your perspective could help someone who's quietly struggling right now. And if you want to hear more stories about family boundaries, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join this growing community. Because silence can protect you for a while, but truth spoken at the right moment can change everything.